All right, David, I'm going to share my screen. Let me do that real quick. Does it say, yeah, it says recording. Okay, let me share my screen. Um, okay. All right, do you see that?
Yep. See it on my end.
Great. All right, let me do the slideshow. All right, so let me move this so that I can, sorry. Got I've got screens, several screens, but so hopefully I'll be able to do this. All right, so this is a training, a workshop on managing difficult conversations and feedback. And I'm going to go through the outline first. We're going to look at how your tendencies and hardwiring affect your approach in managing difficult conversations and why you should have the conversation, how to prepare for the conversation, how to deliver the conversation, and how to set expectations for follow through and follow up. Just so you know, I'm using a combination of some things I've learned from the Townsend Institute as well as from my Giant training when I was trained for the Giant Worldwide team. So, all right, we'll start with your tendencies and hardwiring. So, the framework that I like to use to show this is this support challenge matrix. And we all have tendencies based on nature. Some of us are more comfortable with high support, and some of us are more comfortable with high challenge, just based on how we're wired. If you're focused on if you're comfortable with high challenge, your task focus, you don't mind the difficult conversation, but you can struggle with the delivery. And without preparation, you might bury the person when you have the conversation. Other people, are high support and you focus on relationship and harmony, and you tend to avoid the conversation or avoid conflict. You might drop hints, and at some level it doesn't ever get had until you are so frustrated, and that can obviously cause a culture of mistrust because people don't really know where they stand because they think they're fine and then all of a sudden they're not. So the goal is being a calibration of high support and high challenge, and depending on your tendencies, one will be easier than the other. So one way to calibrate that is to have preparation for having a conversation, so that if you're uncomfortable having it, you feel prepared. If you're ready to go, you dial it back and have it in a more helpful way. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to just ask me. So the other thing as far as tendencies, is to just kind of think about what's in your head when we think about giving feedback. There might be some fears, there might be some thoughts that are you are believing are actual prohibition, like I just can't have this conversation, and really trying to work on what are the limiting beliefs you have. So again, one way to sort of dial back that inner dialogue and just get to it is be prepared. And so that's what we're working on today, is the preparation and being comfortable doing it well. This is also something you can think of as far as the other person. All right. So why should you have the conversation? One thing I'll ask you, what do you think happens if you don't have the conversation, like in a group setting or even just in any relationship? What do you think happens?
Yeah, typically it starts to fester, right? You can feel the tension in the room. It makes it hard for you to interact or engage with that person. And it can kind of like clog up the group dynamic and make it difficult for you to move forward as a team.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all good. That's for sure. What the culture can become like, people are mistrust. They don't trust where they stand. They're unsure. And we all know, we've all been in a situation where everybody else is kind of like, it's like, hey, there's something here, but why is nobody talking about it? And,
Yeah.
can eventually affect morale, of course. One thing also to consider is in this element is, ensuring that this is a conversation, that is needs to be had because of effective performance and isn't an offense that you have, that you just need to kind of work on internally. So that is just one thing I always talk about, before you jump into it, that is an important consideration. Okay. There's another thing to consider is that, when we don't go directly to the poor person, it will eke out. We might be saying things just sideways, or we might even be dropping hints. And, the direct kind feedback, we want to choose truth over harmony. But it's speaking the truth in love. And that matrix that I showed you can also kind of look like grace and truth. And it's the calibration of both grace, like a lot of support, but also truth with this talent challenge. So you see this little diagram. Anytime you don't go straight to the person, eventually it goes into drama and gossip. And it could just be because it's not being talked about, but it also could be because you're not really able to contain your frustration. Mm. Okay, preparing for the conversation. So, this is also, as you've thought about, this is also, an important part of just not rushing in. There are some things you can do to prepare. I like to have a framework for looking at what all's going on. And you've probably heard hands, head, heart as, things, dynamics, do they have the capacity, to do it? Do they want to do it? The other part that I always like pull back to at the top level is the organization. Like, is this happening because they don't even know what their role is? Is there an organizational cultural issue affecting them? And so as you look through this is a framework. And again, all of this stuff is in your materials, but as you look through the kind of doing your homework for the conversation, you want to look for root causes so that when you enter into the room, you're ready to have an open dialogue and maybe even ask some of these questions. You could bring this into the conversation or bring these questions. You're not wanting to come in with just emotional information or emotional feelings. You want to be working on objective languages. And you also this also would help on the part of owning your part, which we will talk about when you have the conversation, is that, if you're the manager, or you're working side by side, or however the work is going, if they don't have the right training and you give them the opportunity to say that kind of takes it off of it being something wrong with them or something emotionally personal. And the hard questions are the hardest. And some of that is really assessing the situation. And, those would be questions you probably wouldn't ask directly, but you could suss out in the conversation. So this gives you framework to ask the questions. Do you have any questions before I go on?
No, fantastic.
Okay, the other thing is just measuring expectations. And it's always good to think about, are my expectations realistic? If there's nothing, and that can also go up against the performance diagnostic. Okay, so what other questions would you think you might want to be asking? What should you consider about yourself when you're sort of doing the research behind?
What do you mean? Would you mind redefining the question for me?
So when you're doing the prep work, are there any other questions that I have missed or that you can think of? Like, if you've been trying to get ready for a conversation, what other questions have you asked of other people, asked of yourself about the other person? Or
I think for me personally, I need to look a bit inward, and you kind of mentioned this in one of your previous slides as well, of like owning my part, right? Mm-hmm. Like, what part do I have to play in the potential conflict that I'm causing with another individual, right? Because so many people are so quick to point fingers, like, you're always this, you do this, and like there's a certain part of you that's involved in that friction, right?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, and that's sort of, well, then the next slide we talk a little bit about the questions that are good to ask yourself. Is what you don't want to enter into the conversation with with a wall of self-preservation. And the only way to do that is to really, as you said, reflect inwardly. And these are questions that I use all the time. I mean, the first time I saw this sort of concept, I was like, I really pretty much have to ask these questions every time I'm going to have a difficult conversation. Because I can tend to have self-preservation or just wanting to get it done. And I'm not really entering into the room with any kind of vulnerability. And so that's a really good point. And this also is in your materials. So, you can put this up on your wall and use this as questions.
Into the fridge.
Yeah. You kind of have to get to the bottom of the issues. And then a few other considerations, what are the tendencies personality wise? Imagine how they will receive the feedback. That's flipping this over and thinking so for instance, I'm very direct, but I typically have worked with people who are not. And so I've had to learn that, whereas I do not actually like the praise sandwich because I don't trust it. I don't want a bunch of that. I just want you to tell me. I have heard people tell me, no, I want you to tell me that I'm doing well before you tell me something bad, because I need to hear that first. And so I've had to really learn the people I'm talking to. One idea that it has worked well for me is doing a role play with somebody who I think is similar to that person, as long as it's not, crossing boundaries. But like, maybe my husband is very different than me, but very much like some people that worked for me. And so I'd say, I need to talk about this, and here's what I want to say. And, having him tell me that lands horribly. This is how I feel. And so kind of sussing out and fleshing out some of that. And then always just asking yourself, how would you want this to be handled if you were them? That's always a really good question to ask. And then preparing, the last sort of idea of preparing is, what do you share? Who to share it with? And I say this in that, are you actually talking to the right person? Because sometimes we get frustrated and we don't do the right person. And then when to share it. Timing is everything. That includes location, that includes, protecting other people when you have the conversation. Do you need to get out of the building? The whole dynamic. So these are good things to think about. All right, now we're going to deliver the conversation. So tips to stay connected, just really good EQ tips, maintain open body language and eye contact. And I would say, if you're reading these things and it feels, it's like something comes up in you probably aren't ready to have the conversation, because you brought some emotion in that you probably need to park again. Focusing on the issue and seeking to understand different perspectives, find common ground. And these are just sort of tips. And again, this is in your materials, so you can pull that up. And then I'm going to just walk us through, and you have this in detail in your handouts today, but really it's so great to have sort of an order of how to walk through this. And so Dr. John Townsend has an 8-step conflict resolution model. I think this is brilliant to use, even with just giving feedback, especially if that feedback might be sensitive. So it doesn't have to be that you have a blow up with somebody. It can literally be used in that way. So we've talked about a lot of this. The very first thing is you've got to create emotional safety right at the beginning by being regulated, having a I am for you stance, showing respect. And that is important to step into there. The second part is stating the concerns specifically and quickly. So all that prep work you did allows you to do that. You're not going to be vague. You might have, should have a few examples. Then you got to own your part. All that prep work also helps you to own your part. And then it's time to shut up and just sit for a minute and hear them out and deal with any diversions there might be, but also you may not have all the information. And so, like I said, you can even bring conversation questions like, you may not be clear about this role, or is there some other training you need, like ways to get them to open up. And then because you're looking for a change, you need to have a specific behavior change that you're asking. You owe it to them to be specific so they can actually act on this. And then at times people may get really upset, or you need to remind them that this is serious, and either back out of the room because they are not at a good place and you actually have to, kind of settle down a little bit, help them settle down or set a boundary. But hopefully that doesn't happen. And a lot of times it doesn't because you've set the stage for growth. And then at the end of the conversation, unless you've had to set a boundary and stepped away, you just reset that I am for you stance. And I think one of the most important things is that we all have a harsh inner critic, no matter how confident somebody is. And so checking back in after 24 hours, just, hey, how's it been going since our talk? Like, any questions? And even if it's a real logic minded person, if you approach it and be like, hey, is there any clarification you need? But make sure they're not going down in the same cycle, because then it would have been kind of a waste of time because they won't be able to act on it. So that again is in your material, but to refer back to, but it's a really great way. I'll just stop here. And how do you think like this would land if you had a hard conversation to deliver?
Well, I think one, having a structure to go to, because oftentimes there's a reason they're called hard or difficult conversations, is people don't know how to navigate them well. And having a layout like this to, hey, do this, make sure you're hitting these touch points. And even if the person doesn't receive it well, at least know that you did your part well, right? You weren't attacking, you owned your contribution, and you presented it in such a way where if natural consequences are necessary because of the way they reacted, at least you handled it the right way on your part, and you can hold your head high knowing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's helpful if it helps to stay emotionally regulated. When I've used a structure personally, and then setting expectations and follow through, checking back in the next day. But I also like to use something that Giant calls the core process, which is asking them to sort of reflect on what's my learning opportunity, and then have them go ahead and write out this, call it and own it. Like, okay, this is what we're talking about. This is their part in it. How are they going to respond? And then sort of follow up to execute. So I wouldn't have them maybe do this in the moment, but give them this framework. And really the goal here is having them, what is my learning opportunity? And this also gives that space for them to come back and say, I heard you, but for me to do this or change, I do need more training, or I am unclear about. And it makes it more objective and less emotional. So this is a really good tool to use. Yeah, so that is what I always leave people with. A couple references. I used the Cloud and Townsend. That 8 steps is from a book he has if you want to read more about it, and also the Giant Worldwide Visual Toolkit. Thank you for listening. So appreciate it. David, do you have any questions before we end our time together?
No questions. That was very thorough, and I just look forward to the opportunity of continuing to work together as we have difficult conversations together.
All right, thank you. I'm going to stop the share. All right. I think you're supposed to give me feedback now.
Yes. Also, so I really had a question. So a lot of the Giant toolkit, I love the framework they had about like going directly to the issue instead of having the firewall. Is that what they called it?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Like I love that graphic. That was fantastic.
Yeah.
No, the entire presentation, very professional. It looked very well done. It was very well organized. The only thing is what we talked about beforehand is because it was so much material, it's better designed to kind of go through with people over a longer time period. I know with the time frame we have over this, you kind of had to rush through, but like the material itself was fantastic. It was very well done. It was very well organized. It made sense. It created a lot of opportunities to interact and engage with the people that you were with to have deeper, more meaningful conversations. Other than because of this particular format, it felt rushed, but I know in the format you would be using it in, you would have an hour conversation, and I could very much see it being a very productive conversation. So yeah,
what I will tell you that I learned this, and I put this in my comments because it says something like, what did you learn? Or I don't know if I posted it, but whenever I post it, I'm going to say that I actually want to give a workshop space in there for them to kind of lay out having a conversation with somebody, like bring to the, like say some, before you come, if there's a conversation you need to have or feedback you want to give, just think of something or see something you already did but wish you did it better, or something you need to do right now.
Yeah.
And then give them a time to role play with one another. In,
Yeah.
you know, if I'm working with like managers, this was given to a team of mid-level newer managers and organizations, so they would be able to talk to one another, you know, about the conversation and it not be inappropriate, or even just role play
Mhm.
with me and someone else. Like, you know, I think role play would be so helpful in this, and you need more
Well,
time for that.
well, and it's a great way to get them because like whenever someone's like just presenting information to you, it gets to a point where you can start to like check out a little bit. Whereas
Right.
when you bring them in and have them role play, like
Yeah.
that's where they start to realize, like, oh, I see how these lessons are really, which I know in this dynamic it doesn't really work, but like whenever you're actually in, in a center going through it, it's incredibly productive that way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, I mean, we're at like 20 minutes now, and I
Yeah.
think I think that, I mean, this could go an hour easily if I
Easy.
pull all the way back and let them had them a lot more role play and, hey, sit down and write this out. Let's
Yeah.
talk about it. So yeah. Yeah, all good feedback. And yeah, all that stuff. I mean, I just to let you know, I could send you a link to where it is on, you know, where you can get all the little graphics from Giant. They're all really good. They're little videos that go with them. So
Yeah, I don't know much about Giant. At some point, yeah, I would definitely love to. That's not something I'm familiar with, the concept I'm familiar with. But every graphic and every material that you shared from them, I really enjoyed.
yeah, yeah, I've really liked using their stuff. It's super plain and simple, which is my
Yeah.
favorite thing.
Well, there's wisdom and it's like it's simple truths, right? And it presents it in such a way where like people could just look at it and be like, that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. Any other feedback?
No, no, like seriously, it was really well done. It looked nice. Yeah, I have nothing but good things.
All right. Let me stop recording.